So thank you for gathering. That today's webinar is about housekeeping and quick wins to save energy. I always start by quickly plugging other things which are coming up in the next few weeks. So we have got webinars between now and the end of February, 2 different dates for our webinar on solar panels for churches, 2 dates for electric car charging, and the final run of this webinar today. We're deliberately running some of our webinars at 6 p.m. to help people who work throughout the day to be able to attend them. So if you finish today's session and think, oh, I'd really like these other people in my church community to come along, then they can sign up for the one at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 26th of January. All the details of the webinars are on the Church of England website. And Joe, maybe you could help me by finding that link and putting it in the chat. So as I said before, it's great if you can mute your microphones and keep them muted during the webinar to avoid any background noise. We find they generally work better if people other than the speakers keep their cameras off. And if you've got questions, then type them into the chat box. If they're things which Joe or I can answer whilst Matt is speaking, then we'll just quickly answer them in the chat. Otherwise, I'll grab those questions and we'll ask Matt them at the end of his presentation section. We are recording the talk, but before I post the recording on the website, we trim off the beginning and the end, if that makes any difference to the questions that you feel happy to ask. And after today, I will send you the slides, so you've got them to refer to, and I'll also send you a link through to our short feedback survey. It's only got a couple of questions, and it's really helpful if you're happy to click through. So in terms of who's here running the webinars today, there's myself and Joe from the Church of England Environment Programme team. I lead on bricks and mortar issues, and Joe leads on hearts and minds issues. She's within Mission and Public Affairs, and I'm in the Cathedral and Church Buildings division. But then our speaker is Matt Fulford from Inspired Efficiency. He is the Sustainability Advisor at Gloucester Diocese and a very, very experienced church energy auditor, and he will be giving you the fruits of his wisdom of what he's learned in all of those visits to churches. So I think, without any ado, if I stop sharing my screen, and Matt, you are happy to start sharing yours, then you can make a start.
Hopefully you can all see that slide.
I can see that very clearly, so I think you're right to go.
Perfect, excellent. Well, thank you, Catherine, for the introduction there. And good afternoon, it is now, to everyone joining from around the country. As Catherine said, my name is Matt Fulford, and having audited probably hundreds, if not more, church buildings over the years, this presentation is very much around some of the quick wins, some of the things that you can hopefully learn from today, take away and implement in your churches over the next coming weeks and months. So it is those quick ideas that you can roll out and deliver fairly quickly on that. So we'll be covering a number of points out there. So we'll be looking at kind of energy bills. We'll be looking at things you can do in your boiler rooms. We're having a very interesting debate, which I'm sure will stimulate lots of questions in the chat around background heating, and then look at some other areas, quick things that you can do. I'll try and leave plenty of time for questions at the end, as Catherine says. Put the questions into the chat as they pop up into your head, and we'll get round to answering those at the end there. So yeah, please do put them in chat as we go through on that. So as I said, I'll start off by having a look at the energy bills, which may seem a sort of slightly strange place to start, because actually looking at energy bills isn't going to actually save you energy per se, but it can save you quite a lot of money. And there's no better place to start sort of winning friends and influencing people around the importance of energy and saving energy than saving a few pounds to start off with. And also, if you save some money on your energy bills, it can be a really good way of building up a little pot of money that can then go in to invest in energy saving measures, purchasing light bulbs or whatever other devices it might be, to get some energy savings delivered as well. So it's a good way of building that fund up as well. So if you were to grab hold of your energy bill, the very first thing that I really would advise you to check is how much VAT you are paying. This should be fairly obvious on the bill. And there's an example of a bill, well, actually just my pointer on. There we go. There's an example of a bill down the bottom here. This is a gas bill from a church which I've anonymised. And you'll see that on most energy bills, there are two VAT rates showing. There's a 5% rate and a 20% rate. As churches, we are all charities. There is a charitable status that we all have, and therefore you should only ever be paying 5% VAT on your energy bills. As you can see, this example here is an example where they're paying the wrong rate. And because they're paying the wrong rate of VAT, they're also being charged something called climate change levy, which is a tax that's added on to energy bills because of the climate change damage that energy causes. But if you are only paying the 5% VAT rate, you will not be charged CCL, the climate change levy. That won't be charged either. So you get a kind of a 15% saving from the VAT, and you get a further saving by not being charged CCL within that as well. So it's certainly something that's well worth checking. If you find that you are being charged incorrectly for your VAT, then you can quite simply go on to any well-known search engine. Even the lesser-known search engines, I suspect, still work. And if you type in your supplier name followed by the words VAT declaration, it will give you a link to their form that you fill out. It's normally 1 page long. Just asks for your contact details and your account number, and a declaration to say that actually, because you are a charity, you should only be charged 5% VAT. You send that off to them, and then they make sure that you are being charged the right rate and not charged CCL going forward. The good news is you can also ask them to, if you are being charged the wrong rate, you can ask them if you can claim that back, and they can go back for up to 6 years. So there can be quite a little windfall coming if you've been paying the wrong VAT rate in CCL for the last 6 years. That's easy to do when you've been with the same supplier over that time. If you've changed suppliers during that time, it's much harder. But you can certainly go back for as long as you've been with your current supplier in there. And in terms of how common this is, in a sort of 2012 study, we looked at about 50 churches, and we found that at least 5% of them were being wrongly charged their VAT. So you can imagine if you multiplied that up, that'd be quite a large number of churches around the country. So it by no means is everybody, but it is worth looking at. One thing just to be aware of, try and look for, particularly when you're looking at the gas bills, if you are a church that uses gas, try looking at the bills that are levied in the winter when you're using the most amount of fuel. There is another exemption, which is the one which is why you'll only be being charged 5% at home, which is if you use a very low amount of energy, what they would deem to be a domestic amount of energy, then you're only charged 5% automatically. So it may well be that in the summer, you're not using any gas, you're automatically charged 5%. But in the winter, you may see that you're charged at 20%. And that's because they haven't got this charitable VAT declaration that you can pass on to them. Whilst you've got your energy bills out, two other things you can quickly look at. One is actually what rates you are paying for your energy and whether that is a reasonable and sensible rate out in the marketplace. Again, going back to that 2012 study, we found that the difference between the highest energy rate being paid and the lowest energy rate was 2.5 times. So you can sort of imagine if it was a 10% electricity or 10 pence a unit electricity rate as the lowest, 25% 25 pence as the highest. So it's quite a considerable difference in there. So it's certainly worth having a look at the rates that you are paying. and seeing whether it's worth contacting your current supplier or looking at changing. And if you are thinking about changing, or even if you're not, it might be worth thinking about changing, because one of the quickest wins that you can make to help your church become zero carbon is to make sure that you're procuring all of your energy, particularly electricity, from 100% renewable suppliers. And there are a number out there in the marketplace that are available through various parish buying schemes and the like, that are using those 100% renewable supplies. And it is, without a doubt, the quickest, easiest thing that churches can do to reduce their carbon emissions is purchase a renewable supplier. So whilst you've got your bill out, see whether you are, and if you're not, seriously have a look at making that switch to a renewable supplier. Don't put your bills away just yet, though, because one other thing that you can do is use those to understand how much energy you are consuming in a year. And as part of the annual parish returns, there is now the energy footprint tool, EFT, which will ask you to record how much energy consumption your church is contributing, and to log that in there alongside the times that the church is used and those kind of things. And then you get an energy footprint result. And that's really important because that gives you a baseline, that gives you a starting point. And if you're then going on to implement some of these quick wins and some of the longer term measures that are out there, you can start to see your progress and start to see those improvements that are being made. And success breeds success. There's nothing like a good news story to kind of encourage everybody along. So if you get that data from your energy bills now and put it in, even though you might find that you're sort of slightly disappointed that you're getting a low result now, you've then got somewhere you can really improve and really drive forward from. And understanding that baseline and going through that can sometimes be quite illuminating in its own right. And you're suddenly questioning, well, why are we using gas in the summer? And those sorts of questions can come out, and then you can react to them. So do grab that energy data off there, and please do put that in the energy footprint tool, because the data you put in there is then looked at by some dioceses, and it is looked at centrally as well, and that helps to kind of steer things going forward. So please do that as part of your annual parish returns that are out there. So moving on from the bills now, we're going to go on to the meters. So the really exciting stuff, if you're into that kind of thing. So somewhere within your church, you will have some energy meters, and particular one to look at is the electricity meter. And if you have an old-fashioned style electricity meter, often with a dial on it that's spinning round, and you have something which has got two rates to it, or even more rates than that, but typically churches often have they're charged on what they call a dual rate. So they're charged for electricity during peak times at one rate, which is higher, and then you've got an evening and weekend rate, which is much lower. Very sensible thing for churches to do, because obviously churches tend to get used more in evenings and weekends than they do during the daytime. So it's quite a sensible thing for churches to do. But if you have one of these old-fashioned meters, next to that you will have an old-fashioned mechanical time clock, which is set up by the electricity company, and that tells the meter when to turn from peak to off-peak. But when you have power failures and other things that go wrong on the electricity network, this mechanical time clock can start to drift out. So quite often it's saying the wrong time, and in many cases it's even saying the wrong day. So that your meter thinks that it might be 8 o'clock in the morning on a Monday, when actually it's 6 p.m. in the evening on a Sunday. And those differences can make quite a large error in terms of how much you're being billed. So if you do have this sort of arrangement, and as meters are being changed and you're going along to smart meters, this is slowly disappearing. But if you do have this arrangement, and if you notice then that the time clock is out, it is very well worth contacting your electricity company, pointing out that their meter is in fault, and asking them to come out and fix that. What they'll probably do is come out and install one of these new smart meters, which has got other benefits to it as well. And the value of that, just to put it into context, I had one church where we looked at this and we found that it was wrong. and they were paying £500 more a year than they should have been because they're being charged the wrong rate at the wrong time. So it can have quite an impact out there, and it can be a good way that you can get a new meter installed without any cost because their existing meter is in error as well. And if you get the smart meters, they're very good at providing you with a much more detailed data stream that you can then use to analyse when your consumption is actually happening, and you can question lots of other things from that as well. So well worth having a good look at those meters and checking that they are correct, and taking action if they're not. So we move on from the meters now, and we pop down into the boiler room, if you have one, if you're on gas, or oil, or LPG, and you have a boiler sitting there somewhere. There are some good things that are worth checking in the boiler room out there. Firstly, check the actual controls on the front of the boiler themselves. Most boilers will have one or two dials which set the temperature of the actual boiler itself, how much the flow rate of the water coming out of the back of that boiler. And you may find that you actually have two dials on your boiler, which set the temperatures. They look very similar. But in fact, one will be for the burner when it is in a kind of a turbocharged, a high flame mode, and one is setting the temperature for when it's in a low flame mode, which is much more of a tick over rate. And these settings are well, almost always set up incorrectly. I've seen far more of them set up incorrectly than I have correctly set up. Because what you actually want is you want your turbo high flame burner setting to be set lower than your low flame setting. Because what you want to do is you want to have a real big boost to try and get that water up to probably about 65, 70 degrees, and then slowly tick over with a lower flame burner, just to kind of keep it at that level once you've got it there. Which, if you want to think about it, is very similar to your car. You're in a lower gear as you're accelerating, and then once you get to cruising speed, you want to be in fifth or sixth gear, depending on how many gears your car's got, out there, because that's a far more efficient way to run it, is to cruise at that mode. And that's essentially what these settings are doing on the burner. But say you want the low flame burner at a high level, and you want the low high flame burner at a lower level to make that actually work properly. If you've only got one dial on your boiler, which a lot of the smaller boilers have got, you'll see a dial like that out there. I'd say that will be setting the temperature of the water, and that'll just have a single mode burner in there. And I would argue this one is rather too low. Actually, this was set in the summer when someone wanted to pretty much turn off the boiler and have it on frost setting only. But really, in winter, you want your the temperature of this boiler not really to be turned up to max, because you're then really getting that boiler to work very hard all of the time. You want to give it some way of being able to sort of modulate itself slightly. So I'll normally suggest that actually this dial ought to be set to around about 2/3, 3/4. So if you've got this one here going sort of from 1 to 6, somewhere between 4 and 5 would be an appropriate setting for that dial to be set. It just means that you're taking off that top end of the sort of max setting, which means the boiler will always be working incredibly hard even when it doesn't need to be. So I just have a quick look at that there. The other thing to consider, and the frost stat may be in your boiler room, it may be somewhere else, but so whilst you're in the boiler room, have a look for it there, but it may be elsewhere in your boiler room, is to go and have a look at the frost settings. And there'll typically be a frost stat somewhere around, as I said, it might be in the boiler room, it might actually be in the church itself. You'll be able to identify the frost stat because rather than it being a temperature range, which is going to be a comfortable range for being in, so typically sort of somewhere between 15 and 25 degrees would be a normal room thermostat. The frost stat will have something that starts off at around about -5 and goes up to about 10 or 15 degrees in there, because it's looking at the frost settings there. And this is setting the temperature at which the boiler will fire to protect the heating system mainly from frost. and stop your pipes from freezing. And if this is set too high, what you'll find is your boilers are constantly tripping in when it starts to get a little bit chilly outside, but is well above freezing point. And the whole heating system is firing, and most times you won't even know that is happening. And it's not unusual to see churches using about 30% of their fuel consumption for frost protection. And the boiler will just be firing up every now and again. No one in the church, it's probably the middle of the night. It'll fire on for maybe an hour, just to warm everything up, and then it will go off. Won't actually heat the building at all. It's heating the water in the pipes to stop it from freezing. But if you've got the setting here set to 10 degrees, it's saying, well, whenever the air temperature around that frost stat gets below 10 degrees, the whole heating system is going to fire, which you really don't want, because water's definitely not going to freeze at 10. And actually, you want that frost stat set to a much lower level, much closer to freezing. It does depend on where that frost stat is located. So you do need to give some thought about whether it's inside the church or whether it's in the boiler room or whether it's very near some cold air, and just give some thought to that. But typically, setting your frost stat for somewhere between 3 and 5 degrees is normally the right sort of range. But as I say, do just have a mind to where that frost stat is located, and if it's in a very cold location or actually going to be in a slightly warmer location, you just want to adjust the temperature slightly for that. But that does stop a lot of getting that set right. Does stop a lot of the additional firing of the heating system that you may not need. So it's well worth seeking out to find your frost stats if you have one, and getting that set appropriately in there. There are other ways we can look at frost protection. You can actually ask your boiler service engineer to install or to pour into the system an inhibitor, which has essentially got some antifreeze, some glycol in it, which means that actually the water within the heating system won't be freezing at all, not unless it gets down to like -15, and then you can turn your frost stat right down to its lowest setting. Is another way of looking at that, but that does require some input and some cost of installing an antifreeze or a glycol-based inhibitor, which are widely available in the market, and most boiler service engineers will be able to install that for you, which is another way to go, particularly if you're examining your gas bills and sort of have a gas AMR meter and start to see some additional consumption when you're surprised it's going on. If you identify that's frost, then putting an antifreeze system in there can work quite nicely. So that's another way around it, but do have a look at that frost stat. That's a very quick and easy win that you can make. Then we come on to the issue that will, I'm sure, raise a few questions, which is the one of background heating. And going and having a look at your timer, your programmer for your boiler, and seeing how that's set up. What times is it coming on? Is that only for service times? Or actually, have you got some background heating going on? Is the heating constantly sort of ticking over? And the advice really over the years has moved on and has developed. And the sort of line that really most sort of heritage organisations are now saying, including Church of England as well as Historic England and National Trust and all those kind of things, is that actually we don't really need to background heat these buildings unless that heating is needed to stabilise the historic interior of the building itself. The vast majority of churches are very happy without any heating at all. I've had many a discussion with a church warden, which goes along the lines of when was your church built, which the reply can often be 1200 and whatever. When was heating put in? Well, it's probably done by the Victorians in 1800 and whatever. And I'm then standing there going, well, therefore, for 600 years, this church stood without any form of central heating. Probably most of that time without any form of heating in it whatsoever. And the fabric was quite happy. Because the fabric of churches really wants stability. It wants a stable temperature and a stable humidity in there. And actually, peaks and troughs, turning the heating system on for a couple of hours every day to, quote, take the chill off, and then letting it cool down again is actually probably doing more harm than good. Because what you're doing is getting these violent swings in the temperature, and that can then cause swings in the humidity. And that's causing the fabric of the church and the timbers and the stonework just to dry out and to move a little bit. And I say that can often cause far more problems than it solves. So do have a look at how that is set up. And say if you have got into the habit over the years of particularly the practice of the heating system coming on for a couple of hours every day because you think that's the right thing to do for the fabric of the church, then have a real think about actually why is that? Why do we need to be doing this? Is there a good reason for it, or can we avoid doing that and actually create a more stable environment? If you've got a church that's been constantly background heated, so 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're thinking it probably doesn't need to be, and you would like to stop that, I would advise that you go and get some proper advice on how to make that change. It probably is the right change to do, but just to maintain the stability of the environment, you'll probably need to do it in quite a careful way, because suddenly going from a heated environment to an unheated environment can kind of unsettle that fabric. So it's about doing that in a gentle and appropriate way. So if you are heating your church, let's say 24/7 with a background heating level, then do get some advice around how to make that change on there. But if you're just doing this sort of 1 or 2 hours a day heating, then that's certainly something that you can probably consider and try and avoid, and that can give huge energy savings out there. The areas of sort of special interest you'll really want to be very careful of is actually more around the artefacts inside the church. So if you have wall paintings, particularly very historic ones, please don't go making any rash changes to your heating system. Again, you'll need to get professional advice from conservators about how to maintain correct environments out there. You will probably also need to give a little bit of thought to the organ. Organs can be very locally treated with the right bit of heating and humidity control in them, just to make sure that they don't deteriorate. And whoever services your organ and your organ advisor will be able to advise you on that, which often involves a very small little bit of electric tube heating being placed in exactly the right place inside the organ, which is actually far better than trying to heat the whole of the church. But those are the things just to watch out for in there. So generally, be very sceptical of background heating. We want to try and avoid it wherever we can, but with just those words of caution about the making the change carefully and considering those other points that are in there. If you're sort of avoiding background heating and getting away from that, you might get a bit concerned that actually, is my church going to become uncomfortable? And actually, there are many things you can do that will help to improve the comfort of people in the church. That doesn't involve actually having to try and get really high air temperatures. Because the air temperature within the church is only one thing that influences how comfortable people feel. And what we really want is not necessarily for the air in the church to be at a certain set point. We want the people in the church to be comfortable. That's got to be the key focus of what we're trying to do. And so a few little bits and tips about how you can have a more comfortable experience, particularly in winter, in churches, which are a very efficient way to do it, is to certainly think about pew cushions or pew runners. Because actually one of the ways in which people feel comfortable or uncomfortable is not the air temperature around them, but the temperature of the surfaces that they are in direct contact with. So you'll be sitting on a pew, and therefore your body will be in direct contact with that wood. But if you've got a cushion or something that's a bit more insulating there, you will feel more comfortable because that'll be warmer. You'll be losing less heat from your body out into the fabric of the pew itself, because you've got that insulating material that it's sitting on. So well worth looking at, I say, pew runners or pew cushions. There you will notice there is a cunning little asterisk at the end of both of those. And that is because they may be things that you will be encouraged to speak to your DAC about. That's not to say they will necessarily require a faculty, but they may want to know about them and give you some guidance on them, particularly things around colours and styles, because I'm sure they wouldn't want to have anything that is a garishly, I don't know, neon pink kind of pew cushions scattered around the church, if that's not appropriate for that building. So you may just want to get some advice from your DAC if you're thinking about going down those ways. And as well as adding cushions to the actual seat of the pew, another areas you can look at is adding some form of matting actually on the floor, so you can put your feet onto something which is far warmer. That would of course need to be a breathable fabric, sort of carpeting type of material. That's there, and again of an appropriate colour and style, that can be very useful because you can also lose a lot of heat actually through the soles of your feet into stone and timber floors. So as well as having a runner on the seat of the cushion, a runner actually on the floor can be very useful too. And another slightly more challenging point, perhaps, depending on your view on these kind of things, is actually looking at service times and the sort of things that you've got going on in your churches during the colder winter period. So there is some sense in moving service times and having a wintertime schedule which is different from a summertime schedule, because churches are often blessed with very large windows, which can actually take in a lot of the winter sunshine and warm up that church. But it takes time for that church to warm up during the day. So perhaps moving to a later service time in the winter to allow the sun to come up, to warm the building naturally, and going for a later service time so you've had that benefit, can be more useful than going for a very early one in the winter. The other sort of area to think about is actually, where do we hold our sort of PCC and other sort of meetings, particularly in the winter? And a number of churches going, well, we always hold our PCC meetings in a church, but it's bitterly cold during the winter. It's like, well, why are you even having your PCC meeting in probably what is the coldest and most difficult to heat building in your parish? In the winter, by all means, hold them there in the summer. But in the winter, actually, could you hold your PCC meetings around the log fire in your local pub and help them out as a local business? You may have a view on whether you want to hold it in a venue that serves alcohol or not. That's a decision you may want to make, or actually hold it around someone's dining room table, or other venues which are going to be more suitable to being well heated and more comfortable in the winter, and therefore you can afford trying to heat the huge church building for a small meeting or something along those lines. So it's worth just having a look to see actually what's the appropriateness of a venue, and do we actually need to be using the church for some of the smaller meetings during the winter that can be better held elsewhere. So they're sort of challenging points, but they're worth giving some thought to, because the energy savings can be considerable. So a few other bits and pieces that are worth looking at around the church is you'll probably have somewhere lurking around, and if you haven't, it might be worth looking, getting some installed, some time switches, and obviously simple devices that can turn things off on a time clock. So places where they are very useful to be installed is on any sort of hot water, little electric hot water systems. So if you're fortunate enough to have a toilet or a small kitchenette in your church, it's probably got a little water heater there that's typically run on electric, and it's very useful to have a timer on that, so that hot water isn't being kept constantly hot 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if you're only using your church for a few hours on a Sunday morning. And you can install a timer. This is a very typical one, image of one here. It gets installed on the outlet where the cable comes out of the wall. There'll be something probably called a fuse spur at that point. And you can literally change the faceplate of that to a timed-based one. And any competent electrician will be able to change that for you very easily. and then you can have a time clock on there, and you can just turn around and say to your hot water unit, right, if I'm only doing a Sunday service, I only need to come on from 8 in the morning till midday or whatever it is, to warm it up at that point, and then during the week it can go off and can save you quite a lot of money from not constantly being kept warm at that point in time. And if you do have those timers in there, do just have a look at the time settings and make sure they're appropriate for the use. Often, over time, people have gone along and fiddled with them and changed them. So it is wise to go along and have a look at them sort of every year or so and make sure that they are set appropriately. The other area that can have time clocks is external floodlighting. And often you'll see this type of time clock. There are lots of different styles out there, and there's some digital ones out there as well, but very frequently you'll see something with a dial that looks something similar to that one on the right there. And it's worth giving some consideration to how that external floodlighting is being used. And in this, I'm talking about kind of external floodlighting that is illuminating the building, not necessarily security lighting, which has a separate purpose and probably ought to be controlled by motion sensors, because that's much more appropriate for security lighting, because it alerts people that there may be somebody lurking around that perhaps should or perhaps shouldn't be there. But external floodlighting, that is lighting up the sort of the church, so that when you're driving past it or walking past it, you can see the beauty of the building. And debates about actually what time is most appropriate for that to be on. I have a road sweeper going past my window, so hopefully that noise of that isn't being picked up too badly on this. It will soon pass. So with the external floodlighting, you obviously want it coming on at dusk. That would make a lot of sense. And these sorts of timers tend to have, most of them have a dusk setting to them. And you can choose between sort of early dusk or late dusk within there. But that's really the time you want it coming on. So then the question comes in about, well, when do you want it to go off? And really, you don't want it to go off any later than 11 p.m. at night. After 11 p.m., actually, light is considered to be a nuisance because it upsets people's sleep. So local authorities will put around and say, actually, that's the sort of a nuisance point out there. So it certainly wants to be off before 11 p.m. And interesting, when we've done sort of consultations with communities around sort of timing on lighting, a lot of people are going around and saying, actually, you know what, you can turn it off at 10 p.m. It's perfectly all right, because the only people that really are going to sort of see it after 10 p.m. is those leaving the pub, although that may not be the case depending on what tier you're in at the moment. So, you know, actually that isn't really what I want. We want people coming home from work to see it at that time. And actually taking off 1 hour every single day can make a very, very big difference. The other thing to consider with floodlighting is actually, when do you want it on? And there's some really interesting things that different churches do around using their floodlighting actually to support the mission of the church and to highlight that. So some churches will use it in the opposite way to flowers. So you don't have flowers at Lent and Advent, but they'll have their floodlighting at Lent and Advent instead, because they want to highlight the church in the community in the lead up to the important celebrations of Easter and Christmas. And they'll have off at the rest of the time, because actually they feel that by only having it on at those periods of times, it makes that point of difference. And people don't just get normalised to the lighting being on. They suddenly see it and go, oh yes, the church does exist. Maybe I'll consider going along to those services. Other churches use their floodlighting actually as a way of getting a very small amount of income as well. And they'll use them in a memorial or an anniversary situation. And people in the community can ask for the floodlighting to be on of an evening on a specific date, perhaps in memorial to somebody, or perhaps to celebrate their wedding anniversary or such like, and they'll pay £5 or £10 or whatever the church wishes to charge for the floodlighting to be on for that event, which is quite an interesting way to sort of link the church and the community together, gain a little bit of revenue, and perhaps sort of turn down the amount of times that the floodlighting is being used, and therefore save some energy in there as well. So a few little thoughts on timings there for you. The next kind of area of quick wins is to go out and do a little, really, this is really chiming to the word housekeeping in the in the title of this presentation, is to go out and do some cleaning and some dusting. That can really help to save some energy out there. So if you have fan convector heaters, which when you take the cover off, they look like this inside. And these are ones that will heat up at this central point here and then have a fan that blows, the actual fan is behind that grey part there. It then blows that warm air out. If you've got those, you can remove the cover. Dust is a very good insulator. So all the dust build-up on this filter here stops the heat coming out and reduces the performance of the heating system. So getting a vacuum cleaner and hoovering that dust off is very useful. One word of warning, these parts can be very delicate, and particularly these metal fins down here are extremely delicate. So rather than just go ramming in there with a metal end of the vacuum cleaner, probably worth putting on that soft sort of carpet brushy attachment on it and just gently cleaning all the dust off there. This filter normally lifts out and removes, so you can clean both sides of it, and that tends to make these units work much better. Radiators themselves may also require a bit of cleaning. Now, you won't be able to do this with a hoover. You will need a boiler engineer to do this. But if you look at radiators and find they are cold at the bottom, and these are thermal images here, that will show the darker points being colder and the lighter points being much warmer. So if you find there's some cold patches on your radiator, particularly lurking around at the bottom, that will probably be because there is some sludge build-up in those radiators. And that needs to be cleaned out. I'd say a heating engineer can then do a flusher of the system, or can remove a radiator and just flush the radiator locally and remove all that sludge out of the system. And you can see this is the same radiator. That's before it was cleaned, and that was after it's cleaned. And you can see how much difference, a huge amount of difference in the temperature output of that radiator that is there. Where the sludge builds up, interestingly, will depend on where the pipe inlet and outlet pipe of the radiator is. So this radiator has its inlet coming in at the top and outlet at the bottom, and therefore the sludge builds up in that corner first. This radiator here has inlet at the bottom and outlet at the bottom, and therefore you'll find the sludge will build up in the middle. But it will be the bottom built up first, and then slowly in the middle. So if you do find you put your hand on the radiator, you run it from the top down to the bottom, and it's cooler at the bottom, you do want to speak to your heating engineer about getting that flushed out. If you find the opposite is true, and actually it's warmer at the bottom and it's freezing cold at the top, that will be because you have some air in your radiator, and you just want to get an air bleed key, which you're probably used to doing at home, and bleed the air out, and then the whole radiator will be getting much warmer. And that'll make the heating system much better. It'll make your church heat up quicker, and therefore you may not need the boiler on for longer, and therefore it can lead to an energy saving that way. So worth doing some cleaning and some dusting around the place as well. Another quick area you can look at is actually adding in some insulation. And the real area you want to sort of focus on as a quick win around insulation is the pipework in the boiler room. So we'd often find that if you go down to your boiler rooms, you can see pipework here entirely unlagged. It ends up being the warmest place in the church, and really you don't want that to be the case at all. You can often find that the pipework, as you can see in this picture here, you've got a little bit of pipework insulation, this sort of silver stuff going on there. And then when it gets into the difficult bits, the bits around where the valves are and these other sort of complicated joints, they kind of give up with the insulation. And you can see that on the thermal image here. The straight pipework is insulated up to there. It's insulated from there onwards, but around the pumps and some of the valves, they've missed out the insulation. And you can get jackets and a flexible insulation that fits around those, keeps the warmth in the heating system, makes sure that the boiler room isn't the warmest place in the church, and gets more of the heat into the church, and that makes it for a much more efficient system. So do have a look at the boiler room and see what insulation you have in your pipes, and add to that if needs be. Again, if you can't do that from a DIY point of view, you can certainly get your mechanical heating engineer to do that insulation for you. Drafts are a real nuisance when it comes to comfort. There's nothing more uncomfortable than a draft. So looking at some measures where you can reduce drafts is really important. And doors will often be the biggest source of drafts, and particularly the bottom of doors. So you can see from this thermal image here, this door actually closes quite well down the middle and down the top. But it's this cold draft that you can actually see starting to stream out from the bottom of that door, which will be causing the problem. and a very simple sort of sausage dog solution can be put on there. So you can put that in there, and that stops the draft coming in the door there. If that's a fire door, you probably want to attach that to the actual door so that when it opens, the sausage dog moves out with the door itself and doesn't cause a trip hazard. Curtains as well can be a particularly useful way to prevent those drafts coming in to the church. So really do make sure that they are closed, particularly during that warm-up period. Again, if there's a fire exit, those curtains will need to be opened when the building is actually in occupation, and all the congregation or concert or whatever, everybody's inside. But during the warm-up period, they can certainly be closed. That will allow the church to warm up quicker. If you have opening lights in your windows, particularly these sort of hopper type of window arrangements, you'll typically find that the bit of the window that opens doesn't tend to close very well against the frame. A real simple technique there is to use some black plasticine, which is very much approved by heritage organisations, because you can just peel it off when you don't want it, and you put that black plasticine in there, and that will seal up some air gaps and stop drafts coming in from that area. Keyholes, particularly big old-fashioned metal locks with whacking great big keyholes, can actually be a surprisingly large source of drafts. And my best tip for those is to go and get a fridge magnet, paint it black, and stick it onto the onto that metal lock and cover the hole. Obviously, it can be very easily removed. If you don't want to go and get an old fridge magnet, you don't like the place you went to many years ago, and paint it black, you can actually go online and buy purpose-made ones with a picture of a keyhole on it if you are so inclined. So yeah, a fridge magnet type of approach over the keyhole can be quite useful there as well. A few final sort of quick tips around saving things. There are some light bulbs that are very easy to change. You can change them yourself. You can have as many jokes as you want about how many people it takes to change a light bulb. This is your chance to make them. But there are some particular types of light bulbs that are really, really easy to change from a DIY point of view. So if you have a light bulb that looks like that, technically that's called a par 38 reflector lamp. If that's not an LED, if that's a normal standard version, that'd be using 120 watts. You can get LED versions of these that use about 15 to 20 watts, and it is as simple as unscrewing the one you've got and screwing in the new one. So if you've got lights like that, really, really easy to change. If you've got these little downlighters, you'll often have them in your kitchens and bathrooms around the place. There are two types of them. They look almost identical when you are standing underneath them and looking up. But when you take the actual fitting out, there's a very important difference. So this type here, which is the mains voltage one, actually known as a GU10, will have these sort of mushroom-shaped lugs on the bottom, and you have to twist that unit to get it out. That can be very, very easily changed from a halogen one, which would be 50 watts, down to an LED one, which will probably be more like 5 watts. Literally, twist one in, twist one out, it'll work. They're great. They're really easy to do. These ones, say they look the same, but they will push in and push out, and they have these two little pins on the bottom. That's because they are low voltage, known as MR12s, lamps that are there. They're technically a little bit trickier to change because they will have something, a sort of a low voltage driver transformer behind them, sitting somewhere else. And there are compatibility issues between those drivers and LED units. So they can be changed. There's no problems. You can do it, but it is more likely to involve an electrician to make sure that coordination between the transformer and the new LED lamp is correct in there. So I wouldn't necessarily go advising that you change that type with the two pins yourself, but certainly changing the GU10 type with the mains voltage type with these two lugs that you twist, you certainly can do yourself. And the good old-fashioned GLS lamp, which will either have a screw fit, as you can see here, or a bayonet fit cap that you'll probably be very used to at home, that can be really very simply changed to an LED lamp out there. So those three types of lamps, if they are, or bulbs, if you want to call them that, if they are inside your church, certainly do a DIY job and change those yourself. And finally, it's not energy saving, but there are some really quick win water savings you can get out there. So if you do have a toilet within your church, you can go to your local water company, and typically they will give you some free water saving items, and you can go along and stick a system displacement device so it's a bag full of sort of material that expands when it's put into water, and that will take out some of the water volume from your toilet system, so you use a little bit less water for every flush out there. Whilst you're looking at a toilet system, if you've got one of the more modern type ones with the push button, just check that valve doesn't start to leak. There's actually quite a big issue with them. There's a telltale sign that if you start to see some sort of lime scale, some light brown staining on the back of the toilet pan itself, is not because your cleaner's not doing a very good job, or because your toilet system is leaking and you need to replace the valve at the bottom of that. House bricks used to be used. They're still just as good, but if they don't post very well. So if you want something a bit lighter and cleaner to do, then you can go and ask for those from your water company. They'll probably also be able to supply you with some free kits to convert your taps into low flow taps. And if you have where the actual water comes out of the tap, if you've got something you can unscrew what's there, and you can then put in one of these inserts and screw it back up again, and you'll convert that into a low flow tap. So those can be very quickly and easily obtained, probably free, from your water company, and installed yourself very easily. So I hope those sort of tips have helped. That's run through that. I've just left 5 or 10 minutes there for some questions. I haven't been keeping an eye on chat as I've been talking, so we'll see what questions you've come up with. I hope you found that useful.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Matt, for all of that.